Welcome to the Passion for Patients podcast. I'm Tonya Winders, your host, and the president and CEO of GAP, the Global Allergy Airways Patient Platform. We are 130 patient advocacy groups from all over the world that are working towards one mission: to help those living with atopic, allergic, and airways diseases live better and breathe better. Today, I am glad to welcome back Ruth Tal-Singer, our Chief Scientific Officer. Dr. Ruth, our own Dr. Ruth, is here today, and we're going to continue the conversation on engaging in clinical research. And I just want to say thank you for taking your time out for being back with us and sharing a bit more of how our members and patients all around the world can get involved in this work.
Thank you. So this is really exciting. This is my passion project, doing research. And when we think about patients, I wanted to quote one of my mentors in patient advocacy, the late John Walsh, who was the founder of the Alpha One Foundation, COPD Foundation. And Tonya, you knew John very well. And he always used to say he was an impatient patient, nothing about us without us.
Yes.
If there are no patients involved in clinical research, then we're not doing the right thing.
Yeah, I try to live out the spirit and embodiment of John Walsh on the daily. I mean, he truly was a mentor to so many of us in this space. And I can vividly recall him saying, nothing for us without us, right? And being so adamant that we be at those tables. And that, honestly, he was a pioneer in the space. And if he had not done the work he had done, we wouldn't be here today. That's the truth, right? I wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be here. No. And certainly the advancement of the patient voice would not have come as far because of people like John. Yeah. So really excited to have the conversation today. So as we kick off, thinking about research, this term big data has really been circling in the space for probably the last 10 years. What is big data? What's that all about?
Yeah, big data. So big data is a lot of information that gets analyzed by computers. It's very, very efficient. You can have billions of different possibilities to look at data, and it can grow and grow and grow. And the more it grows, the more we learn. So I've been very, very fortunate in my career to participate in a number of large disease understanding studies, primarily in respiratory, looking for disease understanding that will help us develop better treatments for people with lung disease. So I'm sharing a slide with many of you of all these big consortia and big data sets that generated information, including a study that I led called Eclipse, where it brought together a lot of different partners from around the world working together. But there are many, many studies in respiratory, UBIPRED, in asthma, spiromics, in COPD and COPD gene. And all these studies, bringing the data together, helped us identify actually a biomarker that I mentioned previously, the blood eosinophils, for example. That story came out of those studies. So it's really important to have those large studies that bring in the patient data.
Yeah, and GAP, it's been so great because we've had the opportunity to really engage with UBIPRED, with the PRECISE network in severe asthma, to see how these big data sets actually are transforming the science and bringing that patient voice forward. How do we capture the patient voice in research?
Yeah. So we're starting from these big studies, these big disease understanding studies. They include a lot of patient-reported outcomes. So this is the patient voice that I mentioned in the previous podcast. And we understand subsets of patients. We call them phenotypes or endotypes, and the biomarkers that are related to them, and helping us understand what is the unmet need or what are the treatable traits that could be used to treat a patient. So that is the first part. Then there's digital health, and you asked me about it before, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the biosensors and the apps and all these patient electronic...
All the gadgets.
All the gadgets, exactly. They measure what's important to patient. And we want to reduce patient burden in research and to capture the patient insights. If you think about a clinical trial in the past, the patient had to go to the clinic, spend all day at the clinic. Yes, it still happens, but now it happens less because they may not be having a bad day on the day that the measurement's taken, but sometimes they are having a bad day and are not feeling that well when they're in the clinic, and that could really mask the results of a trial. So having the digital health is a great way to bring patient input.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we all really just want to be people. We don't want to be patients. We don't want to be all consumed with our disease or with, taking a full day out of our life to go participate in clinical research. We want to advance the science. We want to have our voice heard. But if these tools can help us to do it more pragmatically and in the real world, keeping us with our families and doing the things we love, it makes it all the better.
Yeah, it's more real world. So one thing that's also really important is to do the end of trial questionnaire. So these are communities surveys. It could be a focus group that we ask the patient, how did we do in the clinical trial? How can we design a better trial? How did you feel during the trial? Is there something that we didn't ask about? Because a lot of time we get answers to what we're asking. What we're asking is based on what we're thinking. But maybe something came up in the study that we didn't know about, right? So having the end of trial interview or end of trial questionnaire is important in understanding what really happened during the study. And finally, there's the real world that you mentioned before, and that's health records. And a lot of us have health records. Being willing to share our health records allows the big data to happen, right? Because then you can have thousands or millions of people providing data, doing nothing in terms of their day-to-day, as you said. Everybody wants to be at home and with their families, but we can really understand, is the medicine working? Is it cost-effective? And obviously cost is something you've worked a lot on in terms of access.
Yeah, I think that, again, in sharing our health records, it's so important to think about how is it going to be used? Is that information private and protected? And we talked about that some the last time. But there's so many ways patients can really engage in clinical trials and in research. What are some of the other things that maybe we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah. So I wanted to quote Albert Einstein. So beyond participation in clinical trial, we need to listen to the person who has the answers. We need to really understand who has the questions too, as they said before. So a trained patient or a caregiver of a patient could partner with researchers to either be a representative on an advisory board. So this is not participating in the trial, but it's advising how to conduct the trial and what is important to patients. It makes the board more robust and more patient-centered when we understand what patients actually want, or caregivers, and participate in the evaluation of what is the impact, what are the gaps that we're trying to solve to make sure that patients are engaged well in the study.
So when we talk about research planning, right, because all research starts with a plan. We have to have a plan in order to execute that plan. How do patients get involved in that part, in the actual planning of research?
So patients or patient advocates could contribute the research question and relevant outcomes. And that is really important in developing and helping the developer or the researcher put the question together and define who are the participants that really fit the study, and is it the right population? So again, sometimes we get some insights from patients, and patient advocates work with a lot of patients of what are the characteristics of a participant. We review the study materials or the protocols to make sure that it meets the health literacy requirement in lay terms so patients understand what's being done in the study. Patients can participate in recruiting other patients, and we are patient advocates, and we participate in recruitment of study participants. We can participate in data collection and analysis, and of course the communication, publication, and we talked before about lay terms and the work the GAP is doing to make sure the patients understand the results of a study.
Yeah. So a lot of our member organizations have not yet really dedicated time, energy, resources to research. It's kind of a new thing in most parts of the world for patient advocacy organizations to be actively involved in research. So if you're talking to one of those newer organizations, how would you encourage them to get started in this space of engaging in research as a patient advocacy organization?
So the first thing is building a community, because by having a community of patients and caregivers alike, you can participate in recruitment of patients, which is the simplest form of contribution, is bringing the people into the more experienced researchers. The other piece is to train, and we are very good at helping with that. There are a lot of resources that we can provide, and smaller patient advocacy groups can be a part, could train in research to be an active member beyond recruitment, to be an active member of the research group and help with the dissemination, the communication, making sure that the questions that are asked in the study fit their country. Because I don't really know what's happening around the world. Gavin, we have a lot of organizations with different cultures, so making sure that the material is culturally appropriate, and really to be a part of getting around the world, of bringing one voice together and understanding the disease and understanding the intervention. And the last piece is, as patient advocacy groups get together, is participation in registries. So having that willingness to share health records or to share data around the world will make our medicines more accessible to everybody.
And I think it's such an exciting time, and we're on the horizon of being able to use artificial intelligence in those big data sets, understand trends within those registries of millions and millions of records. And so I think it is where probably 5 years ago, people were fearful of that, right? And they just weren't quite so sure if they wanted to be a part of something like that or how their data might be used. Now we're seeing that we can have artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence, as I like to say, really to better analyze that data at an aggregate level, not at your personal level, but at the joint aggregate, bigger level, and understand more about the diseases day after day. Now, one of the things that I've heard a lot about, and I'm sure that some of our members have, is patient-focused drug development. What is that? And where did it come from?
Yeah, it came from the FDA, coined patient-focused drug development with the aim to better incorporate patient voice in drug development and evaluation, because the patients and the caregivers are the experts with a lived experience. We can think of a lot of things, but the regulators understand that patients are uniquely positioned to inform the understanding of a drug as it gets evaluated in the clinic. And so the regulators wanted to ensure that the patient experience, the patient perspective, the need, priorities are meaningfully incorporated in the development of medicines. And that is new. That is not something that was there in the past. It's thanks to patient advocacy groups like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was very, very involved in the development of medicine for a rare disease, to really engage the patient voice in drug development. So the FDA in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, has these areas that they seek patient input and caregiver input on what bothers patients the most, what are the symptoms that impact their lives, and what is the burden that they have when they manage their disease, what is it that we're trying to fix with new therapies, but also understanding the different approaches to treatment and how would treatment impact, or a disease would impact the patient's daily activity. So it's really, you mentioned that before, it's living with the disease every day. We need to understand that. And so it took a while, but regulators started understanding that aspect is as important as something that you measure with a biomarker or with blood pressure.
Absolutely. And I would say sometimes even more important than those objective measures of disease, right? Because it's the real world. It's how this disease is impacting us at a daily level, our activities of daily living, our finances, all the different aspects of life. And I actually have had the privilege of participating in a couple of the FDA PFDD meetings, one in eczema, the one in food allergy, and very interesting public forums where our regulators, the Food and Drug Administration is hearing directly from the patient community. Have you been a part of those?
Yes,
Tell me a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, and maybe I was on a more, I came from industry initially, but one of the reasons I started working with John Walsh that I quoted before is that in COPD, on chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the accepted outcomes by the FDA, by regulators, is looking at exacerbation or flare-up of the disease, looking at lung function, measured by spirometry, and death. That's it.
Not good outcomes.
Not good outcomes.
Not the best outcomes.
Not necessarily the most important to patients. So when we do big surveys, we know the patients care more about their day-to-day activity, the ability to climb stairs, the ability to hug a grandchild and play with them, or the symptoms, the cough and sputum, especially during COVID, when people can clear out a movie theater just by coughing or on an airplane get dirty looks, right, if they cough. So symptoms was something that was really not focused in patient-focused drug development, because there are no outcomes that are accepted by regulators that can get a drug approved. So it's very, very expensive. We mentioned in the previous podcast, think about $1.5 billion to develop a drug, and then you get to the last study and symptoms are not as important as some other outcome that may or may not change with a new intervention. But patients do care about symptoms. So my involvement with the agency, beyond being a drug developer, was to advocate for acceptance of new outcomes, like the CAT that we talked about before, like measures of shortness of breath, like physical activity and exercise. So those were discussions where regulators were asking tough questions, rightfully so. But as a patient advocate, it was really, really important to bring our voice together. And Tonya, you participated in the patient listening session that we brought together. It was October 2021, where we brought multiple patient advocacy groups, got in the room together, and patients spoke about how shortness of breath, or dyspnea, as we call it clinically, impact their lives, why symptoms are important to patients.
And even topics that pretty historically have been off the table or sort of taboo, like sexual health, for example. I remember in that setting, hearing from people living with atopic dermatitis all over their bodies and how they didn't want to be touched, how that lack of intimacy had changed them as a person. I recall, again, in the listening session around COPD, that breathlessness and the inability to even walk to the mailbox or to do their grocery shopping, to not be able to do the very basic skills of daily living. So I think that's a really important advancement that, again, our regulators are listening to us more. But we still have a ways to go. There are still a lot of barriers to really equitable inclusion in clinical trials and clinical trial participation as a whole. What do you see as some of those key barriers?
One of the barriers is we talked about the diversity in clinical trials, and a lot of times there are communities that don't have access to big centers, and it's not that they're forgotten, it's not that people don't care about it, but how do you bring the clinical trial to the patient to make sure that now that we know that drugs are not one size fits all and it's not going to fix everybody, who is going to respond to the drug and who is not going to respond to the drug? So beyond the barrier that I described of outcomes that are meaningful to patients, that we need to have more of them, it's to make sure that we have more diversity in our clinical trials. And also, clinical trials are done in a very, very controlled and very well-defined population. As you go to the real world, people don't fall necessarily into that category. Is making sure that exclusion criteria, those that don't allow somebody to participate in the clinical trial, are relaxed a little bit. And again, that's where the regulators and the patients come in, because a lot of patients said, I wanted to be in a clinical trial, but I was excluded because of X or because I have this other condition. And so I understand the precision in clinical trials is essential, but we also have to think very carefully, which is why the patient's voice is so important, is to understand how broad can we make a study without compromising the result, but also making it applicable more in the real world setting.
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge is how do we make sure that clinical trials are representative and ensure safety and efficacy, which are the typical endpoints that have to be met for a drug to be approved, but then that it goes beyond that. It's not just safety and efficacy, it's also impact on the actual real world lived experience of those living with the condition. So I know we're kind of coming to the close of this particular podcast. Ruth, anything that you want to reinforce or just kind of sum up for our listeners today?
Yes, and thank you. I think the most important thing is educate yourself. If one lives with a chronic disease or is an advocate for a patient, like many of us, a family member with chronic disease, is making sure you're educated, that you understand the benefit of clinical research, understand how medicines could help or how new treatments are developed, and think about volunteering. Contribute in some way, either to recruitment or adding your voice to a survey that is completely hands-off in terms of going to a clinic, and really encourage people to educate themselves on clinical research.
And I would encourage our member organizations out there and the listeners to the podcast today, if you've got this burning question that you want answered, that is a research opportunity. Like, that's how these research ideas come to fruition, right? So bring them to us. Contact Ruth at research@gap.org and let's talk about it. Maybe there's a way that we could do a survey together. Maybe it will evolve into more of a true clinical trial type of program. But what we're doing a lot of now is really insight gathering. And then we're taking those insights and that data and getting them into the peer-reviewed medical literature, getting that patient voice heard more and more consistently over time, and developing those impressive assessment tools like the CAT, like the COMPEX, which is another one that we've been working on. And maybe we'll come back and talk about that in another podcast. But as we close this episode, I just want to thank you again, Ruth, for your expertise, your knowledge, your depth of understanding of this that is so much more advanced than most of our member organizations or our patient advocates out there. We're just getting on this journey and catching up. And you're 30 years ahead. And I am so glad that you're a part of our team and helping to lead us to that future of what it truly can be for patients. I also want to just remind you as our listeners out there today to visit gap.org, where you can find some more of the downloadable resources that we've talked about here on the podcast today. You can actually look at our research mission pillar, figure out ways that you or your members of your own patient organization can get more involved in research. We're here to help you, and so certainly reach out to us at research@gap.org to learn more about how to get involved in research. And until next time, stay passionate.